David Clark.
Mr. Speaker, kia ora.
Talofa lava.
Talofa lava. Well, Mr. Speaker, what a lot of rhetoric we have just heard. I don't even think the member himself believes much of it. He might believe well that his government has spent money in certain areas, but he knows very, very well that the record of job creation is so poor, it is an embarrassment. It's an embarrassment around this House. He wanted to raise the issue of Labour's track record, and I will happily raise that issue again. Under the Labour government, since the war, we've had a 3.7% average growth rate. Under National, it has been 2.9%. There is a considerable difference between those two numbers in real terms for real New Zealanders. Labour grows the economy consistently, National stalls it. Under this government, real wages have dropped. Real wages have dropped. Median wages, the New Zealander, Joe New Zealander, is really feeling the pinch, and it's as a result of the policies of this government. The 2010 tax cuts, well, let's go back to them, where 40% of the value of the tax cuts went to the top 10%. 40% went to the top 10%, and the bottom 20% got just 2% of the value of those tax cuts. Now, that is typical of this government. This budget does nothing to change that picture. The rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, Mr. Speaker. This is a government that is creating a two-speed economy, a bigger gap between the haves and the have-nots. Mr. Speaker, this budget, if it does anything to raise average wages, has an attempt to do it one mighty river power director at a time. That is the way this government approaches it. It looks out for those who have vested interests, those who are its mates. It looks to transfer some money to them, but the average New Zealander, Joe Normal, is struggling, Mr. Speaker. The average New Zealander can no longer dream of owning their own house. The average New Zealander can no longer dream of having a decent job because this government is destroying those jobs, it's creating unemployment, and it's driving wages down in real terms. This government has created the worst current account deficit in the developed world. Mr. Smith disputes that, but this government has created the worst current account deficit in the developed world. It's worse than Greece. Worse than Greece, the IMF tells us. This government has brought about a credit downgrade. It has had New Zealand's credit downgraded. Kiwibank's on notice now. This government does not know how to manage an economy. And that is the real shame, Mr. Speaker. This budget was another opportunity to address the structural issues in New Zealand. Those opportunities are flying by, and with it, New Zealand's chances of raising its place in the world, of creating a better standard of living for its citizens. This government is taking the country backwards. This government is taking it backwards, Mr. Speaker. And let's remind ourselves, this government is the government with the worst economic record of any government in this country in the last 50 years. This government's only idea, Mr. Speaker, is to sell off the best revenue-generating assets. That is their only vision for this economy. Labour would do things differently, Mr. Speaker. We've announced our New Zealand power policy. That would bring businesses' power bills down by 5 to 7%. It would put an extra $200 or $300 in Kiwis' pockets. It's a sensible policy. It's a policy that's about taking New Zealand forward. We'd put in affordable housing, Mr. Speaker. We would create 10,000 new houses over the next 10 years, and that too will create jobs. Not only will it make an affordable house an affordable dream for New Zealanders, it will also create jobs. And let's remind ourselves that these things that we have now, these situations where housing is unaffordable, where power keeps going up, are things that can be fixed. We know from Professor Wolak's report that there was $4.2 billion worth of price gouging in the New Zealand energy market between 2001 and 2007. $4.2 billion worth of price gouging. We've been told by academics, we've been told by those who have researched that this is a pattern in New Zealand, that the market doesn't work. When a recession hits and the rest of the world's power prices go down, they go up in New Zealand. Something is wrong here. It can be fixed. We know that markets are good when they do the bidding of the people, of the citizens. When the markets do not do the bidding of the citizens, they make terrible masters. And this needs to be corrected through effective regulation so that businesses can thrive, so that citizens can thrive. There is a problem here that needs to be fixed. This government is sitting on its hands and not doing anything about it. Mr. Speaker, I've just returned from a trip to the United States. It was a tremendous privilege to go on this trip. Went with the Eisenhower Fellowship. Now, President Eisenhower created as his legacy an international exchange. Many presidents create a large library in their own state, but President Eisenhower wanted an international exchange. I have been a fortunate beneficiary of this. It's been a terrific learning experience. One of the lessons I brought back is about the importance of fairness in New Zealand as a cultural value. Fairness. New Zealanders believe in fairness. They believe everybody should have the opportunity to get ahead. It's part of what makes New Zealand a great place to live. Now, Sir Paul Callaghan used to talk about the importance of New Zealand being a place where talent wants to live as part of a strategy for economic growth. This growing gap between rich and poor in New Zealand drives us in the opposite direction, I'm afraid. This undermines our reputation for fairness. People want to come back to New Zealand once they've had overseas experience because they want to go to a hospital where they don't have to bring out a chequebook. They want access to justice for all citizens so that there's a sense of fairness in society. And they want to know that they can get a great education at their local schools. We want to live in a fair society. And what's true also, Mr. Speaker, is that people in other countries admire the sense of fairness that New Zealand has. It is part of what gives us a privileged place at international trade negotiations. People want to hear New Zealand's voice because we speak impartially, we speak independently, and we speak about fairness. Now this budget which creates a two-speed economy, which drives this two-speed economy which the government has been creating, goes further to undermining this international reputation for fairness. It's not good for us as a people, it's not good for our citizens, but it's also not good for our country. It undermines that reputation we have that gives us that privileged place at the international trade negotiation table. And we need to be at that table if our economy is going to grow. We need to be at that table because we want to be a part of those discussions. The government's mates, they're jacking things up. We know that the casinos are getting extra funding. We know that Goldman Sachs is profiting from the sale of the assets, and we know that the wealthiest New Zealanders have had those tax cuts. This is not the recipe for a fairer society. This is not a recipe for the kind of society we want to live in, and that actually most of the world aspires to live in. We have the largest gap between rich and poor in this country that we've had since records exist. We're becoming an economy of the haves and have-nots. 30,000 jobs were lost last year. 1,000 people in my home city moved from Dunedin to Australia permanently because of the policies of this government. We've had a 10% drop in the last 4 years in non-primary sector manufacturing in this country. The policies of this government have been undermining our exporters. When I left New Zealand, Mighty River Power was 100% Kiwi-owned. Now, Mr. Speaker, 49% of Mighty River Power is owned by just 2.5% of New Zealanders. This is a two-speed economy where some Kiwis are getting ahead and some are being left behind. We need a government that's prepared to bring in pro-growth tax reform. We need to take out that investment distortion that pushes money towards the properties, that creates housing bubbles, that creates people farming for capital gains rather than for profitability. We need tax reform that makes our country more profitable. We need tax reform that promotes research and development. We need universal KiwiSaver so that we're more like Australia, who have $1.3 trillion in savings. Their savings, Mr. Speaker, their savings regime brings back their own financial markets expertise from overseas. When their young people go overseas, they have something to come back to because they have a successful industry there. New Zealand, unfortunately, has suffered under national governments that have not had a long-term vision. They've focused on the short term. They've focused on making sure their mates are looked after, and they are missing out for the rest of New Zealand. They're not interested in creating the society for all of us. They're only interested in a few of their mates, Mr. Speaker, and that's why this budget is a terrible budget that does nothing that is in the interest of ordinary New Zealanders, and I think, Mr. Speaker, this is a budget that needs to be condemned.
Speaker. I call the honourable member Paul Goldsmith.